Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Tonight we depart from our usual projects of highlighting legislative issues to talk about something that's very topical in the month of February, and that is Black History. And today I'm pleased to be joined by Mike Arujo. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Mike, you have a new job, so why don't we take a moment and cover your resume?
Sure.
Because last time you were in the studio, you were working for the Restaurant Opportunity Center. You had been in here previously with the Stagehands, but now you've got a new gig. Why don't you let our viewers know what you're doing?
Executive Director of Rhode Island Jobs with Justice.
And what is Jobs with Justice?
We're a community-based and labor-based coalition organization that's trying to make the economy work for everybody.
Yeah. And how long have you been Executive Director?
This is month 4 now, and it's been a busy 4 months.
What kind of things are you working on?
We've been working on restoring some wages for some restaurant workers, and we won a pretty significant victory. We won $72,000 in lost wages. The employer actually wrote a check directly to the employees. That almost never happens.
And you got great press on that one as well.
We did. Yeah. It was really surprising. The funny thing is that nobody knew what to do. You win and you don't know what to do. I mean, that's the thing. It's like you're prepared to keep the fight going, and then ultimately, so the picket line just kind of petered out. Eventually, we all went to the Department of Labor and got their checks, and it was great.
Good for you.
It's nice when that happens.
And what else is on the near horizon for Jobs with Justice?
Well, so we're working on the Bannister House campaign, which is actually really with SEIU 1199, which is actually makes a lot of sense during Black History Month, considering it's 102 years old this year, I believe. And is a nursing home founded explicitly and specifically for African American women. And I don't think there are very many places that focus on African American women like that. And it's really important that we keep a place like that open and keep it paying good jobs to the community.
And they have a new owner, and I guess there's some threats to its existence.
Right. So there was a threat to their existence about a year and a half ago. The union came together, 1199 came together and helped find and broker a new purchaser for the place, which was very important. It kept people from being displaced, disrupting families. I mean, it really shows you what labor actually does. Like, people think about labor as contracts and conditions in the workplace, but really it's about holding communities together, and that's what they did. So in their contract, though, they're looking for lower contributions to their health care. The new owner wants to do the things that owners do, which is destabilize hours, increase employee contributions in health care, establish a 2-tier wage structure, which 1199 is rightly rejecting and is taking to the streets about that.
So to get back on track, labor history is an important issue. Black history is an important issue. Perhaps you could give us a little insight on melding the two, because in my role as being active in the Labor History Society, having done a little bit of look at what we have in Rhode Island, there's not a whole lot of information about Black history, minority history as it relates to the labor movement. But here it is, Black History Month. What would you tell viewers, in Black History Month that they should be aware of that they might not be aware of?
There's a stereotype in labor about what the working class looks like in the United States. And that picture is almost always might be slightly younger than middle-aged white man, usually a construction worker. It's a hard hat. And that's not to say that it doesn't exist, but really the face of labor is a much broader picture and a much more diverse picture. In the United States in particular, there's only one population that was brought to this country specifically to work, and that was African Americans. There is almost always an aspirational aspect to every other population that came, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's definitely part of what we want. But as far as the working class goes in this country, the original working class of the United States was enslaved African Americans. The first strikes came from African Americans refusing to work, but that hasn't always been part of labor's story. We always tended to compartmentalize the post-industrial and the pre-industrial as two very, very separate things. We also don't think of enslaved African Americans as industrial workers, but they were very much industrial workers. They were the first victims of a globalized economy. Right? They were ripped from their homelands, taken to plantations where, again, the image of a plantation owner is a Southern gentleman in a big hat sipping on a mint julep, but really there were corporations that were owned by multiple parties. Many of them existed in New England. Rhode Island was a central feature of the triangle trade, being a significant shipping port. Some of the first purpose-built slave ships that were constructed in the United States were built in Rhode Island, often by slave labor. Smith Castle in North Kingston has large set of slave quarters attached to it. Little Compton was largely populated by enslaved people with very few plantation owners. Those folks worked. They built mills, they tended fields, they tended cattle, they built ships, they navigated, they loaded, they unloaded, but they were never considered part of the working class, and I think there was an issue there.
I know when most students think about slavery, they think about the Civil War era. And Rhode Island being a northern state, you think about it as a state that is anti-slavery, but that's not the complete story of Rhode Island.
It's part of the story, and that's not to say like Rhode Island's representatives to the Continental Congress, for example, like Hopkins, was very anti-slavery. He was considered himself a true abolitionist, but he was a rum trader. So he profited pretty significantly from the slavery. We don't think about slavery as part of a kind of a continuation of labor. We also try to think of slavery as something that belonged to the South exclusively. But the futures market, the stock market, and trading almost all happened in the North. And most plantations were owned by corporations that were owned both in New England, but in the northern sections of New England, and in the rest of the world.
I know when I think about Rhode Island's industrial history, I think about textiles, and I imagine how dependent Rhode Island industry must have been on southern cotton plantations.
Cotton. Yeah. So there's an interesting thing about that. So obviously Rhode Island's mills could only function with raw material that came, and the raw material that came was cotton. I mean, there was wool production, but that was very, very small in the United States, and the shipping cost for wool was huge, and also was a very, very fragile product. It had a tendency for pests to come to it, so it was not a central product here. But we think of the North in the Civil War era as an industrial powerhouse, as a driver, an economic driver, but really it wasn't. If you look at the gross domestic product of the United States a couple of days before the Civil War, if you added up all the railroads, all the shipping, all the mills, all the roads, it added up to 1/10 of the value of the output of enslaved labor. Which meant that because slavery was producing the vast majority of economic output of the United States, it was the economic engine. And many of those companies still exist. Wachovia was a cotton trading company. Lehman Brothers traded exclusively in cotton and slaves. They famously had a shipping office on Pearl Street in New York. But beyond that, getting back to kind of a more labor focus, in the early part of the 18th century, 19th century, Thomas Powderly and the Knights of Labor, as the United States was getting more industrialized, realized that there needed to be some defense for working people. And so they organized the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor do not get the recognition that they really should get. Thomas Powderly, a white northern industrial worker, believed that a labor movement that didn't include everybody would never succeed.
And this is an organization that predates what's now known as the AFL-CIO.
Yeah, by almost 50 years, it predates the formation of the AFL. He really believed in an equality of labor, and he believed that in the supremacy of labor at the same time, which is something I think that most people would agree. I mean, we frame it as a consumer economy, but it's a maker's economy. Workers build things and we trade them with each other, and that's how we survive. He wanted to include everybody in an economy that worked for everybody. The birth of the 8-hour movement started with Thomas Powderly, and he doesn't get the recognition. His board was made up of women, Chinese American workers who were hugely persecuted against at the time, and African Americans, and that was significant.
And another piece of untold history, and the Knights had a presence here in Rhode Island.
Absolutely.
As well.
In the northern industrial cities, they were hugely powerful. There were obviously some flaws with it, depending on the character of each, what they call it. They called it a lodge. Knights of Labor had lodges. But by and large, they had to adopt an anti-racist, or at least a non-racist principle, which allowed black workers to engage in economic democracy for the first time. It also, because of Thomas Powderly's belief, it was a way to propagate abolitionist ideas, which was so important. It was really a valuable moment. So fast forwarding a few years, in the South, in the immediate post-war years, you saw organization of black workers and northern workers in the South uniting with each other, particularly newly arrived immigrants from Italy and Ireland, organized in protective mutual aid organizations with themselves. During Reformation, or was it Restoration?
Restoration.
Restoration. They did very well. They put together some of the first cross-racial, cross-national organizations. Immigrant workers in the Northeast faced a lot of discrimination. The tendency to move south was important. Also, there was a huge vacuum of work in the South. So they arrived, and they found themselves either in competition with African-American workforce that was already there, and instead of doing the thing that history sometimes likes to make us think, which is like a competitive version of history, they went for a cooperative version of history, and they formed some of the earliest Southern unions. Some of the strongest unions were organized in the South in that period because of that. And that was really important. During that period, however, obviously Klan violence was hugely, was a central feature of African American life in the South and in many northern cities as well. Participation in the political process was often denied. And anytime workers united across racial lines, the Klan rose up more aggressively.
And the Klan was primarily, anti-black, but they had a very prominent anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant feature that most people don't know.
Right. So they were organized specifically to suppress newly found black political power and black economic power. That was the impetus that Bedford Forrest had when he organized the Klan. However, because of the tendency of working people to unite, you had to include immigrants and Catholics in that. The idea that there was a population that could see beyond their own narrow self-interest and work for the betterment of everybody was more than they could bear. And so, honestly, we saw the Klan's reign last from about 1870 to like 1950. It was probably one of the longest, most aggressive periods in this country. It's 1/3 of this country's history in the South was ruled by denying economic democracy and civil democracy to African Americans and immigrants. That's part of the reason why you see the birth of right-to-work laws came from the South. They didn't come from the North. They came specifically to disrupt working people's organizations. And that was where that came from. But when you move forward, though, so you see employers trying to take advantage, oftentimes using the Klan to break strikes and using other racist organizations to break strikes and break workers, or threaten or chase down or act as spies against any time workers tried to unite with each other. Employers had this mistake like they did with immigrants. There's no shortage of short-sightedness when it comes to some sets of people. And they believe that immigrants made for a docile population, which is why they imported so many immigrants to the Northeast, not expecting them to be expecting better conditions. And they also assumed that because slaves knew slavery, once they were freed, they would be docile workers. The idea that people don't actually desire freedom or that they don't understand equality on some basic level is a crazy assumption, but they really made it. So people like the Pullman porters, I think it was Thomas Pullman, tried to only employ formerly captive African Americans as workers, figuring that this would be the most docile group of people in the world. But there's no better organizer on the face of the earth. This is a group of people that knew actual slavery, not wage slavery, not something like slavery. They knew actual slavery, but they also knew actual freedom. And so they could tell a story of both those things. And because they were working on railroads, they could travel the entire country. It was the worst idea on Thomas Pullman's part, but it was the best idea for labor in general. They brought their message of equality from every coast, every tiny town. When the railroad workers started to fight for an 8-hour day, the Great Strike, they were there saying how important it was. They became, because of their organizing efforts, they became the first recognized African-American union in the AFL Federation, which was quite a leap. Samuel Gompers was not a progressive when it came to race issues, but their force, their power definitely illustrated that. And that period was short.
And their leader, A. Philip Randolph,
is a hero.
A labor icon.
Yeah, he's an icon. And he's one that I think people should really... He had a vision of America that is so much broader than the one that I think we think of. One that was inclusive and open and wealthy and free. And he also believed in like common values, of labor's common values, in spite of whatever opposition you're thrown. Labor believes in the unity of workers. And labor believes that workers have a better vision of the world and are better at it than other people to manage their own affairs, and they should be trusted to do so in their own organizations. And that was tremendous. A. Philip Randolph also, something that people don't know, also had his protege was Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin was an African-American Quaker, openly gay, union organizer, and relentless when it came to that. He cared deeply about freedom. He saw it as the overarching principle of our world. And he saw it as something that all oppressed people need to achieve. And that included working people. He was one of the architects of the modern civil rights movement, he and Ida B. Wells. He's often written out, and so is Ida. And we tend to focus on leaders like Martin Luther King because it's much easier. But it was Bayard Rustin and Ida Wells that kept an economic focus as part of a civil rights platform. And he also turned the civil rights movement from something that was marginal in the 30s and 40s into something that became the defining feature of the middle of the United States. It's the defining feature of the 20th century of the United States, where we saw 12 million people go from no political power whatsoever to having tremendous political power and start to be taken seriously. This was the effort of men like Bayard Rustin, but also the Ruther brothers of UAW and the CIO organizing across racial lines when nobody else would. They did it. And that is something you can never go back from. That's why it's more important than ever that we make sure when we're organizing, we're including all workers. And when we sit in a room, we have to ask who's not in the room. That's what he teaches.
And that goes true to this day, where we have a new wave of immigrants in this state, and
Right.
It really highlights the importance of attending to their needs and desires, as well as that traditional union member that you described
Right.
at the beginning of our show.
Right. I mean, so I would say that is actually traditional unionism. That's a unionism that goes back to the 1700s of people forced to work under terrible conditions and figuring out how to make it better. That's the shape of unionism. So when we see immigrants come in, whether they're refugees or if we see unemployment rates in some districts of Providence reaching 40%, we have to say, as labor, how can we fix this? Because we're better able to fix it. We've been through more. We're like the Pullman porters. We remember what it was like when it was really bad, but we also have a vision of what it can be like when it's really good. And we need to deliver that vision.
Yeah. Mike, unfortunately, we're out of time, but you do such a terrific job of
thank you.
painting a picture with your words. I thank you for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.